The Silent Killers, a school murder mystery. Hook. What happens when the darkness inside you is no longer a fear, but your home? In this twisted journey, one girl faces a haunting battle between the void and her own reality. Will she escape, or will she become the darkness itself? Watch until the end to uncover the shocking truth of who really controls the darkness. The halls were silent. Empty lockers lined the walls, their metal surfaces cold and uninviting. A single light flickered overhead, buzzing intermittently. The air felt thick, heavy with tension. It had been a week since the last murder, yet the school still reeked of fear. Alex walked slowly down the corridor. Her footsteps echoed loudly, unnaturally loud, in the stillness. She wasn't supposed to be here. The school had been locked down, sealed off for investigation. But curiosity had driven her. The walls felt closer now, as if they were closing in on her. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The scent of something stale lingered, old, almost like rotting wood. Her heartbeat quickened. At the end of the hall, the door to the library stood ajar. A faint light flickered from within. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew she shouldn't go in, but she couldn't stop herself. She pushed the door open. The air inside was colder, the darkness deeper. The light flickered again, casting long shadows on the floor. Books lay scattered, pages torn, a few still open. Then she saw it, a body, lying face down in the middle of the room. Her pulse raced. She stepped closer, her feet moving before her mind could catch up. The body was twisted, limbs contorted in an unnatural way. The room was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, suffocating. Suddenly a sound, a sharp intake of breath. A figure moved in the darkness, just out of sight. Alex froze. Her eyes scanned the room, but there was no one. The figure was gone, swallowed by the shadows. She backed away slowly, every nerve in her body screaming to run. But her legs wouldn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on the body. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the stillness. She jumped, startled. Quickly, she pulled it out. A message appeared on the screen. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. Asterisk, her heart raced as she stared at the message. Her fingers trembled, hovering over the screen. Who could have sent this? Her mind screamed for her to leave, but her feet remained frozen to the floor. The phone buzzed again. Asterisk, leave now, before it's too late. Asterisk. The words sent a chill down her spine. She turned her head back toward the dark corners of the room, half expecting something to move. But there was nothing. Her breathing quickened. She wasn't alone. She could feel it. Something was watching her. The faintest sound broke the silence. A footstep. Too quiet to be sure, but it was enough. She turned, her eyes scanning the library in desperate search of an escape. The windows were closed. The door was the only way out, but it felt miles away. Another step. Closer this time. Her heart pounded in her chest, threatening to explode. She reached for the door handle. Her hand was slick with sweat. The door wouldn't open. It was stuck. No, she thought, her mind spiraling. She pulled harder, panic rising in her throat. Her nails scraped against the cold metal. The sound, high-pitched, grated against her nerves. Then a voice, low, hoarse, just behind her ear. Don't run. Alex's blood ran cold. She spun around, but no one was there. The shadows seemed to stretch further now, creeping across the floor like tendrils, slowly, deliberately. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She had to get out. The door gave way with a sharp creak, and she stumbled into the hallway. Her legs were weak, unsteady. She ran down the hall, turning corners blindly, but the feeling of eyes on her never left. Her phone buzzed once more. Asterisk, you can't escape. Asterisk. She glanced down. Another message. But this one had no sender. A dark figure appeared at the end of the hall. Tall, with a hood that obscured its face. Alex stopped. Frozen. The figure stepped forward, and then it smiled. The smile was wide. Too wide. Alex's breath caught in her throat. The figure moved closer, the shadows swallowing its form. Every step it took seemed to echo in the hollow hallways. Closer, closer. Her legs felt like lead, but she had to move. She turned, running again, each footstep pounding, frantic. But the figure was right behind her. She could feel it. She glanced over her shoulder. It was almost there, its long fingers reaching toward her. A chill spread through her veins. A door. Ahead. She reached for it, pulled it open, and slammed it shut behind her. She backed into the room, gasping for breath. Her eyes darted around. No windows, no other exit. She was trapped. Her phone buzzed again. Asterisk, it's too late. Asterisk. The lights flickered. Once. Twice. The door rattled. A slow, deliberate sound. She turned, but there was no time. The figure was inside the room. Its hood was gone, and its face. Alex's stomach twisted. It was familiar. Too familiar. Her own face stared back at her, contorted into a grotesque grin. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her mind screamed in disbelief. She stepped back, shaking her head. No, this can't be real. The figure moved closer, its eyes dark and hollow. The same eyes. You should have never come back, it whispered, its voice a cold echo of her own. Alex felt the walls closing in, the room shrinking around her. The figure reached out, fingers grazing her cheek. And in that moment, everything went black when Alex opened her eyes again. The room was empty. The figure was gone. But she wasn't alone. Her body was stiff, her head heavy, as if she'd been lying there for hours. She pushed herself up, her hands shaking. Her surroundings were unfamiliar, the walls dark, the air thick with dust. She was in a classroom, but it wasn't her classroom, not anymore. The walls were cracked, the desks overturned. A chill ran through her as she stood, looking around. Her phone buzzed again. She reached for it, her hands unsteady. Asterisk, you're still here. Asterisk. Her pulse quickened. How was this possible? Where was she? The phone screen flickered, and there, at the edge of the light, a figure stood in the doorway. Alex froze. Her heart skipped a beat. It was the same figure, but this time it was holding something. A knife. The gleam of the blade reflected the dim light. Her breath hitched. She stepped back slowly. The figure tilted its head, watching her. Its smile stretched wider, too wide, stretching across its face like a mask. Run, it whispered, its voice low and familiar. Alex turned. She had to run. She sprinted toward the door, slamming it open with all the strength she had left. But the hallway was different now. Longer, twisting. She couldn't see the end. Every turn she made led her deeper into the darkness. Each step echoed louder, until it felt as if the walls were closing in, and the air was suffocating her. She could hear it now. The footsteps behind her, slow but steady. Closer, closer. She turned another corner. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of her. The door she had just come through was gone. And there it was again, the figure. It stood at the far end of the hall, its face a twisted reflection of her own. You can't escape, it whispered again. Alex's breath came in sharp gasps. She had no choice. She had to face it. With one last, desperate scream, she ran toward the figure, her feet pounded against the floor. Faster, harder. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. Closer, closer. She could feel the coldness radiating from it now, a freezing presence that made the air grow thick. as if time itself was slowing. Alex's heart thundered in her chest. Her breath was ragged, her legs aching with each desperate step. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The figure's smile grew wider, too wide. Just as she reached it, she slammed into something solid, a barrier invisible yet unyielding. She tried to move, but it was as if she were frozen in place. The figure was right in front of her now. Its hollow eyes stared into hers. The knife gleamed in its hand. "You're too late," it whispered. Suddenly, the world around her shifted. The walls twisted. The floor buckled beneath her feet, and the darkness seemed to rise, swallowing everything. She couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, as though it were pressing in from all sides. The figure didn't move. It simply watched, its smile never faltering. Alex closed her eyes, hoping, praying that this nightmare would end. But when she opened them again, everything was different. She wasn't in the hallway anymore. The walls had disappeared. There was only darkness. Endless. No light. No sound. She was alone. Her heart pounded. Her hands were trembling. Her body felt cold and empty. Then a voice. Soft, barely a whisper. "You've already been here." Alex spun around. Her mind raced. She couldn't grasp what was happening. The darkness shifted. A figure emerged from the shadows. A familiar face. Her own Malik staggered back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It was her, but not. The figure smiled, the same twisted, distorted grin. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. Her hands shook as she reached out, unsure if this was real, if she was losing her mind. The dark figure, her own reflection, stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, closing the space between them. Alex tried to speak, but no words came. The air around her thickened, pressing in on her chest. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, unable to breathe. The figure knelt beside her, its face too close, its smile growing wider still. "You never left," it said softly. "You were always here." Alex's pulse thundered in her ears. Her mind scrambled, fighting against the crushing weight of the darkness. But the figure's eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, held her in place, paralyzing her. Her vision blurred, the edges of the world bending and warping. She closed her eyes, trying to escape, but it was no use. The darkness was suffocating her. The voice came again, gentle, mocking. "You can't escape what you've already become." With that, everything went silent. The darkness stretched on, endlessly, no beginning, no end. And Alex was gone. The silence was deafening. Alex was no longer there, but something lingered, a presence. The darkness swirled, shifting like smoke, filling the space where she had once been. Then a flicker. A single light appeared, dim at first, then brighter, slowly. A figure emerged from the shadows, its silhouette barely visible at first. But it wasn't Alex. Not the Alex she knew. It was the same twisted reflection. The figure moved toward the center of the space, its steps soft, deliberate. Its eyes, those hollow eyes, glanced around as if surveying the emptiness. Then a whisper. "You can never escape." The room seemed to tighten. The air grew colder. The figure turned, its gaze fixated on something in the distance. Alex's name echoed faintly, a memory that didn't quite belong. The figure reached out, slowly, cautiously, and as its fingers brushed the air, the space around it began to twist, to ripple, like something out of place, something broken. The light flickered again, and for a brief moment, the figure's face was visible. It was Alex, but not. The twisted smile was still there. And then the darkness returned. But now it wasn't just silent. It was waiting. The darkness stretched, deep and endless. as if it had been waiting for this moment. The figure moved again, but this time it wasn't alone. There were others, more shadows, shapes that twisted and writhed, too indistinct to make out, yet so very close. Their whispers filled the space, soft at first, growing louder, more insistent. Alex's name was repeated, over and over, like a chant. The air grew colder still, each breath sharp, like ice cutting through her lungs. The floor beneath her feet shifted, cracked and fractured, as if it too was not meant to exist. And then, from the blackness, a single word echoed. Remember? The figure with the twisted smile turned slowly, its eyes locked on Alex's face, or at least what was left of it. It was almost like looking into a mirror, but the reflection was fractured, broken, filling her with an unsettling sense of dread. "You're one of us now," it whispered. A chill raced down her spine. She took a step back, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted in place, trapped. The shadows pressed in tighter, wrapping around her like tendrils, drawing her into their cold embrace. A sharp, piercing sound echoed, a scream, distant and muffled, but it was unmistakable. It was her own voice. The figure tilted its head. Its smile widened even further, and in that moment, the truth hit her like a wave. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was her fate. There was no escape. There never had been. The shadows closed in, thick and suffocating. Alex tried to scream, but no sound came. Her mouth was frozen, her body paralyzed. The figure stepped closer, its twisted reflection of her own face staring back at her. "You've always belonged here," it said softly. The air grew colder still, the edges of the darkness curling around her. Her skin felt icy numb. The figure reached out, its fingers grazing her cheek, and she felt the chill of death creeping into her bones. It whispered again, its voice low and sinister. "Now you stay with us." And suddenly, the shadows around her moved, writhing like a living thing. They pulled at her, dragging her toward the center of the black void. Her body refused to obey, but still she was pulled closer, closer. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm that seemed to beat in time with the darkness. The world around her began to twist, the walls of the void spinning, faster and faster. And then it stopped. For a moment, there was stillness, a cold silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The figure was gone, but the shadows remained. And then, in the stillness, the whispers began again. Alex felt them crawl under her skin, into her very soul. They echoed through her mind, sinking deep into her thoughts. Asterisk, you never left. Asterisk. Her vision blurred. The darkness swallowed her whole. And as everything around her faded into oblivion, the last thing she heard was her own voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was a laugh, a twisted, hollow laugh. The laugh echoed through the endless void, piercing the silence like a dagger. It wasn't Alex's laugh. It was the laugh of something darker. The shadows seemed to breathe around her, and as she looked deeper into the blackness, she could see flickers of faces. They were distorted, contorted, their expressions frozen in agony, their eyes hollow like her own. They were trapped, just like her. The laughter grew louder, closer. It was no longer just a laugh. It became a chorus, a collective cry of suffering, filling the empty space with unbearable weight. Alex's chest tightened, her breath shallow. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. All she could do was listen. The shadows around her began to shift again, swirling like a storm, and in the center of the chaos, a figure appeared. This time, there was no mistake. It was her, but she wasn't the same. Her face was twisted, contorted into something unrecognizable. Her eyes, dark and empty, stared at Alex with no warmth, only an empty promise of despair. "It's too late for you," the figure whispered, its voice a hollow echo of her own. Alex tried to speak, to call out, but her voice was swallowed by the void. Her body felt heavier, as though the very air was suffocating her, pressing against her lungs, dragging her down. The figure took a step forward, and Alex could feel the coldness radiating from it. It was as though the very essence of death surrounded her. "You were never meant to leave," the figure said, its lips curling into that same twisted smile. And as Alex felt herself being consumed by the darkness, the world around her began to crumble. Pieces of reality shattered, like glass, falling away into the abyss. She tried to fight it, but there was nothing left. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her completely was her own reflection. Laughing, the darkness swallowed her whole, and the void stretched out endlessly, an eternal abyss with no end in sight. But within that emptiness, something stirred, a flicker, a pulse of light, faint but growing stronger, flickering like a dying ember. Alex's eyes snapped open. She wasn't sure if she was awake or still lost within the abyss. Everything was blurry, the world around her shifting like a dream. The air was thick, heavy with something she couldn't name. She tried to move, but her body felt foreign, like it didn't belong to her anymore. Her hands reached out instinctively, touching something cold and rough. Stone, perhaps? She pulled herself up, her legs unsteady beneath her. The room around her was dim, barely lit, as if the light itself was struggling to exist. The walls were cracked, the floor covered in dust, as though it had been abandoned for ages. A sharp sound cut through the silence, a low, distant thud. Her heart skipped a beat. The noise was close, too close. She turned, her pulse quickening. The room was empty, but she could feel something, someone watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, just out of sight. Her legs shook as she took a step toward it. And then the whisper came again, low and familiar. "Welcome back." Alex froze. The voice sounded just like her own. She spun around, but there was no one there. The darkness seemed to pulse around her, alive, as if it were feeding on her fear. And then a figure emerged from the shadows, tall, slender, its face obscured by darkness, but its presence undeniable. The air grew colder, a chill that sank deep into her bones. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It simply stepped forward, closer, and Alex realized with growing horror that it was her own reflection, but not the one she remembered. The twisted smile on the figure's face widened. "You've always been here," it said, its voice now unmistakably hers. The darkness closed in again, and this time there was no escape. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, the darkness thickening around it like a cloak. Alex felt the chill of the air tighten around her chest. It was suffocating. She tried to back away, but the walls seemed to close in, pushing her closer to the figure. Her heart raced. Her mind screamed for escape, but her body refused to obey. The figure stopped just in front of her. It was so close now. She could feel its cold breath on her skin. Its eyes, dark, hollow, endless, stared into hers. "You're mine now," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in the stillness. Alex's blood ran cold. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees. The shadows surrounded her, wrapping around her like chains, dragging her into the depths of the darkness. "You can't fight it," the figure murmured. "It's always been you." Her vision blurred. Her thoughts spun. The world around her twisted. And then everything went black again. But this time, there was no sense of release. No escape. Only the weight of the silence pressing down on her. A suffocating presence that felt like the end. Alex felt herself slipping away, fading into the endless dark, becoming one with it. But even as the darkness consumed her, she heard a faint whisper, asterisk, you never left, asterisk. And that was when she realized she never had. The whisper echoed through her mind, its words sinking deep, like an anchor pulling her further into the abyss. Asterisk, you never left, asterisk. The words replayed over and over, each time more haunting than the last. Alex's body was no longer her own, but part of the void, a part of something that she couldn't understand. The darkness didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like it was inside her, filling her from within, her very essence becoming one with it. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. All she could do was listen to the silence, broken only by the whispers, countless whispers, filling her ears, filling her soul. Asterisk, you never left, asterisk, and then a shift. The darkness around her began to stir. It wasn't just empty anymore. There were shapes, figures, moving, twisting in the blackness. They were like shadows, like her, but not quite. They reached for her. Her skin tingled as their cold fingers brushed against her, their touch dragging her further into the unseen. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow. They spoke in unison, their voices overlapping. Asterisk, you belong, asterisk. And as their cold whispers filled her mind, she realized, with horror, that they were right. She belonged here. She had always belonged here. The room began to shift around her, twisting and warping, like a dream breaking apart. And then, as if from the depths of her own mind, she saw it, her reflection. But it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was her, and yet it wasn't. It was the twisted version of her, the one that had been waiting. And as Alex stared into its hollow eyes, the last of her resistance shattered. The reflection smiled, a smile that was both hers and not hers. Asterisk, welcome home, asterisk. And then everything went dark again. The darkness was suffocating, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to swallow everything, every thought, every breath, until there was nothing left. Alex couldn't tell where she ended and the darkness began. Her body was weightless, floating in an endless void of silence. But in that silence, something stirred. A voice, now many voices, whispered, distant and barely audible. The whispers grew louder, growing in intensity until they filled her mind, ripping through her thoughts, tearing at her sense of self. You're ours now. The words were clear now, sharp, unmistakable. The chill in the air around her tightened, and Alex could feel something pulling at her, dragging her into the depths of the void. The darkness began to crack, a faint, pulsing light appearing at the edges. A doorway? Alex's eyes snapped open, but she was no longer in the void. She was back in the school. The hallway was empty, the lockers cold and silent, the familiar flickering of the overhead lights above her, the same eerie stillness, but everything felt different, darker. She moved slowly, her feet unsteady as she took a step forward. The walls felt oppressive, closing in on her, and then she heard it, a sound in the distance, footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the halls. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned, but saw nothing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She was no longer alone. Her body tensed. She couldn't move. Then, from the shadows ahead, the figure emerged. It was her, but the twisted reflection, the one with the hollow eyes, the smile too wide to be real. It stepped toward her. "You're home," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Alex's breath caught in her throat. She knew what it meant now. There was no escape. There never had been. The reflection raised a hand, its fingers stretching toward her, and as the figure's touch grazed her skin, the world around her collapsed. The school disappeared. Everything disappeared, and in that moment, the last shred of Alex's soul was consumed, swallowed whole by the darkness. Becoming a part of it forever, the darkness was all-encompassing, a cold, gnawing emptiness that consumed every last thought. Alex felt herself fading, her body disintegrating into the void, losing her sense of time, of reality, until there was only the endless black. And then, through the stillness, a sharp sensation, a pulse, a sudden jolt that snapped her back, but not into the world she knew. She was in a different place now. The shadows were thick, and the air felt damp, heavy with decay. The walls around her were warped, twisting and groaning, as if the very structure of the place was alive. She could hear faint whispers again, but they weren't from the shadows. They were from inside her mind, echoes of voices, of screams, of laughter, her own. Her eyes darted around. She was standing on cracked stone floors, surrounded by broken mirrors, fragments scattered like shards of glass. She looked down. Her reflection wasn't there. The mirrors were empty. Her heart raced. Something was wrong. Something had changed. The laughter came again, not from the mirrors, but from the very walls around her. The sound was disorienting, rising and falling like a twisted melody. Then, a figure stepped out from the dark. Alex didn't need to see its face. She knew who it was. It was her, but not her. The twisted version of herself. Eyes hollow, grin stretched impossibly wide. It moved toward her, slow and deliberate. Alex tried to step back, but her feet were rooted to the ground. Asterisk, you're here. Asterisk. The voice was chilling, but it wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, a cold force that seemed to envelop her, its weight pressing down on her chest. "You've always been here," it whispered. The figure reached out, and this time Alex didn't resist. There was no fight left in her. Her reflection, the twisted version, was the truth now. The darkness, the shadows, the endless whispers, they had all been waiting, and now so had she. The figure's hand touched her face, and in that moment, Alex understood. She was no longer just a part of the darkness. She was the darkness the moment the figure's cold fingers brushed against her skin. The world around her fractured. Everything shifted, breaking apart like glass splintering under pressure. Alex's vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she could see something, someone, faint, distant, a memory of her former self. But it faded. The mirrors shattered. The walls cracked. And then there was only the deep, endless black. Her mind was empty, her thoughts a haze. There was no room for fear, no room for regret. All that was left was the figure, standing before her, its twisted face staring down at her with that same wicked smile. The words it whispered weren't words at all. They were more like an echo, a vibration, a deep, resonant hum that reverberated through her bones. Asterisk, you are home. Asterisk. The ground beneath her feet seemed to disappear, and she was falling into the endless void. But she didn't scream. There was no panic, no sense of time. The fall felt eternal. And then, as if she were being pulled from every direction, the space around her compressed. She was back again. The school. The same empty hallways. The same flickering lights overhead. But the atmosphere had shifted. It was different now. Heavier. More oppressive. The walls seemed to bend, to breathe. and standing at the end of the hall was her reflection. But this time, it was no longer separate from her. It wasn't just a shadow, a figure in a mirror. It was her, and it was everything she had become. The two of them stood there, facing each other. Alex could feel it now, the connection between them, the shared understanding. The laughter started again, low at first, growing louder, until it felt like the very air around her was vibrating with it. It was a laugh that wasn't just her own. It was the laugh of everything she had become, of everything she had lost. "You've always been here," the reflection whispered, its voice merging with her own. And then Alex understood. There was no escape. There had never been. She was the darkness now, and she would never leave. The laughter filled the space, growing louder, resonating through the walls, through the very ground beneath her feet. Alex stood frozen, her reflection now a part of her, its twisted smile mirroring her own. The air was thick with the weight of it, like the world was closing in, becoming smaller, darker, a suffocating embrace. But the truth settled over her, heavy and undeniable. She wasn't in control anymore. The world, the school, it was all a fragment, a memory, a construct. The reflection, the twisted version of her, wasn't just a part of the darkness. It was the darkness, and it was inside her. Asterisk, we are one. Asterisk. The words felt like a chant, a deep rhythm pulsing in her mind. She didn't resist. She couldn't. Her body, her soul, had merged with the void. The hallway around her began to warp. The lockers bent and twisted, the walls pulsing with the same dark energy. It wasn't a place anymore. It was a feeling, a weight. The hallway was infinite now, stretching endlessly in all directions. And still, the laughter echoed. The reflection reached out, its hand brushing against Alex's cheek. But it was no longer just a reflection. It was her. It was them. "You've always been here," the voice whispered again, so soft, so final. And as the darkness continued to expand, the last remnants of the world Alex had once known slipped away. The school was gone. The faces, the voices, all vanished into nothingness. There was no longer any need for escape. She had become it. And the void, the darkness, was her home now, forever. The darkness enveloped everything, and the last sliver of light blinked out. There were no sounds now, no echoes, no whispers, just the infinite, suffocating silence. Alex stood in the vast, unending void, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full, full of her, full of everything she had become. The reflection, the twisted version of herself, was no longer separate. It was her. She had merged with it, with the darkness, with the space that had once seemed so terrifying, but now felt like a suffocating, familiar embrace. She had become the void, the never-ending silence, the thing that waited for others to enter and disappear. But even within the nothingness, a strange pull tugged at her, a feeling, faint but growing stronger, as though someone was approaching. The air shimmered. The nothingness seemed to ripple, distorting, as if the very fabric of the void itself was beginning to crack. And then a shape appeared. At first, it was just a blur, but it slowly took form, solidifying into a figure standing in the distance. Alex's pulse quickened. Could it be? Was it someone else? The figure was hazy, like a faint memory, but as it moved closer, she saw it more clearly. It was another version of herself. But this one was different. Its eyes were wide, fearful, its hands trembling as if it were trapped, caught in the same endless cycle she had once been. The figure reached out toward her, but it wasn't a reflection. This one was alive, breathing, struggling to escape the pull of the darkness. Just as she had, Alex watched, her heart pounding in her chest. But there was no fear, only an eerie understanding. It was too late for this one, too. And as the figure drew closer, Alex stepped forward, welcoming it into the void. Because now, it wasn't just her, it was them. Forever, the figure drew closer, its eyes filled with a mix of confusion and desperation. It stumbled, fighting against the pull of the darkness that surrounded it. But the void was relentless. Alex reached out, her hand brushing against the figure's arm, and in that instant, she felt the coldness, the same coldness that had overtaken her. The figure froze, its face twisting into a silent scream. It was too late. Alex's grip tightened. No words were needed. There was nothing left to say. The figure, just like her, was bound to this place now. The last remnants of the light faded from the figure's eyes, its form sinking into the blackness, melded with the void, lost to the darkness. Alex watched it disappear, feeling the shift in the air as the space around her seemed to settle, becoming more familiar. The nothingness deepened, but now it felt like a strange comfort, a place where she and the others like her, trapped souls, broken reflections, could exist without fear. She no longer had to fight. She no longer needed to run. The void was her home now, and the darkness was alive, feeding on the emptiness of those who wandered in, those who never understood. And as Alex stood still, watching the endless stretch of nothingness, she realized the cycle would continue. More would come, more would be swallowed by the void, and the reflections would grow, one after another, until the darkness had consumed all. She turned and walked deeper into the black, not alone, but surrounded by the countless echoes of those who had come before her, their twisted, hollowed forms lost in the endless stretch of silence. And with every step, she could hear their whispers, soft, faint, but unmistakable. Asterisk, you've always been here. Asterisk. And Alex, now just another part of the void, smiled, because she knew it was true. The endless stretch of darkness seemed to pull her deeper, and as Alex walked further, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She could feel their presence, like 1,000 eyes watching, waiting, their existence merging with hers. The void had become a sea of endless faces, all of them trapped, all of them silent, but for the whispers, the shared knowledge of the dark. Alex's footsteps echoed in the emptiness, but now they sounded different, more distant, as though she were walking in someone else's memory. Every corner of the void felt familiar, as though she had been here forever, and yet she knew she had just arrived. The walls, if they could be called walls at all, shifted around her, pulsing with a life of their own. They were no longer cold stone, but living, breathing, like the very essence of the darkness had taken shape. And then a new sound, a faint noise, a quiet scratching. It came from ahead. Alex's pulse quickened, but she did not hesitate. The void had been her home for so long now. There was no more fear. She moved toward the sound. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and then she saw it. A figure, bound in the darkness, its body writhing, its hands clawing at the air, desperately trying to free itself. It was trying to escape, just as she had once tried to escape. Its face, twisted, pale, and full of horror, was one she recognized. It was another version of herself. Alex stepped forward, her reflection staring back at her through the void. But this time, there was no understanding, no acceptance. This version, was still fighting. It was still desperate to get out. Alex reached out, her fingers brushing the figure's cheek, and the moment their skin touched, the figure's eyes widened in terror. Asterisk no! Asterisk, the figure screamed, its voice breaking the silence of the void. But the scream was cut off. Alex's grip tightened, and the figure began to disintegrate, its body crumbling into particles of shadow, its scream fading into nothing. And just like that, the struggle was over. Alex stood alone again, the whispers now a constant hum in her ears, a rhythm that she had come to know, a rhythm that was her own. The void stretched on, endless, unbroken, and as Alex walked deeper into its dark embrace, she knew the cycle would never end. More would come, more would try to escape, and one by one, they would become part of the darkness. Just like she had, the void stretched endlessly before Alex, a place with no beginning, no end. Every step she took echoed in the vast emptiness, a rhythm that felt both familiar and alien. The whispers continued, a steady hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. At times, they seemed to call her name, but each time she focused, the voice would dissolve into the collective murmur of the lost souls around her. She no longer needed to run. The fear had long since faded. Now, all that remained was the endless march forward, the quiet acceptance of what she had become. But still, the darkness felt alive. Every shadow seemed to breathe, pulsing with a strange, unspoken energy. Then, out of the deep silence, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow. It was faint at first, but it grew clearer as it approached. Alex's breath caught in her chest. It was another figure, moving through the dark, its shape barely visible. Just another silhouette within the endless black. It was familiar, yet not. The figure moved toward her, its footsteps slow, cautious, as if it were testing the boundaries of the darkness. When it reached her, Alex saw the face. It was the face of someone she had known, someone from her past, someone she had forgotten until now. A cold wave of recognition swept through her, but it was not a comforting feeling. The person before her, still half shrouded in the shadows, looked at her with wide eyes, eyes full of confusion and terror. It opened its mouth to speak, but no words came. Alex tilted her head, studying the figure. There was no fear in her anymore, but she could feel the desperation radiating from the figure in front of her. Asterisk, are you lost? Asterisk, the figure whispered, its voice trembling. Alex smiled, a smile that was both sad and knowing. No, she whispered back. Asterisk, I'm not lost anymore. Asterisk. The figure recoiled, its eyes widening with horror as the truth settled in. It tried to move away, its body shaking as it stumbled back into the darkness. But Alex stepped forward, her feet silent, her presence commanding. You'll understand soon, she said softly, her voice just above a whisper, but somehow louder than the hum of the void. The figure stopped. It turned back toward her, its face now twisted with realization. The last thing Alex saw before the shadows swallowed the figure whole was its eyes, filled with the same terror she had once known. The whispers swelled around her, rising like a storm, and as the figure vanished, she heard them more clearly than ever before. Asterisk, you've always been here. Asterisk. And as Alex stepped further into the darkness, she knew it was true. She would never leave. The whispers lingered, a constant, shifting presence, now louder, more insistent, echoing off the walls of the endless void. Alex felt the weight of them, the pull of those voices that had once terrified her. But now they were like an old, familiar lullaby, a strange comfort in the darkness. She moved through the space, her steps slow, measured, as if the darkness itself was her companion, her only ally. It was no longer just a place. It was her. The figure, the one she had seen before, was gone now, vanished into the swirling nothingness, absorbed into the dark, as she herself had been. But Alex was different. She wasn't the same person who had walked into this place. Not anymore. The shadows that surrounded her felt like skin, the air like breath, the floor like a pulse beneath her feet. She belonged to it. She was it. And just when she thought she had fully merged with the void, when she thought there was no more to experience in this endless dark, a new presence tugged at her mind. Someone was near. A flicker, a faint heartbeat. Alex stopped. She listened. There in the distance, a soft, slow sound. Footsteps, perhaps, but they were different, unsteady. Her eyes narrowed as she focused. Another figure, but this one wasn't like the others. It wasn't yet swallowed by the darkness. It was still struggling to stay tethered to the world outside. Alex could feel its fear, its desperation, a desperate clinging to something that wasn't real anymore. The figure moved closer, its shape forming from the blackness, its form jagged, broken, but still it walked, reaching toward the heart of the void, not yet lost, but not yet free. Alex's lips curled into a smile that carried no joy, only the knowing. This one, too, would be hers. She stepped forward, meeting the figure halfway, its eyes locked with hers, wide, desperate, searching for something she couldn't provide. But Alex knew the truth now, the same truth that had consumed her. The darkness was the truth. The figure reached out a trembling hand, as if trying to grasp at something, anything, to pull itself back from the edge. But Alex reached out first, her fingers brushing against its arm, and in that moment, the last of its resistance shattered. The figure froze. Alex's smile widened. "Welcome," she whispered softly, and the last remnants of the figure's being were swallowed into the void, its struggles silenced forever. The whispers intensified, rising, swirling around her, filling the air like a storm that had been waiting. And in that moment, Alex understood that it was over. The cycle would repeat. More would come, more would struggle, but they would all be drawn in, just as she had been. There was no escaping this place, no way out. Only the whispers, only the darkness, and Alex. Always, forever, Alex. She turned away, walking deeper into the black, no longer looking back, for she knew now that this was where she belonged. The darkness stretched on, its depths endless, swallowing everything in its path. Alex's steps became a rhythmic pulse, matching the heartbeat of the void itself. She moved forward, her presence blending with the shadows, as if she had always been part of it. The whispers now felt like a song sung by all the souls trapped within the black. Each voice, each echo, was a piece of the same melody, woven together in perfect harmony. But even in the silence between the whispers, she felt a shift, a subtle change in the air. Something was different. The void that had once seemed infinite, unchanging, began to pulse, a slight vibration beneath her feet. She stopped. The movement of the void felt alive. Her eyes darted around. The shadows seemed to shift, undulating like waves. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling her mind with an urgency she hadn't sensed before. And then she saw it, a figure emerging from the depths, its form jagged and flickering, like it was being pulled in from another dimension. The figure seemed distorted, its outline flickering like a broken image. Alex took a step forward, her heart beginning to beat faster. This was new. The figure was unlike the others she had absorbed. It was not a lost soul. It was something different. As it moved closer, its form began to solidify, and with it, a cold presence filled the space. Alex's breath quickened. The air around her grew heavier, as if the void itself was holding its breath. The figure was humanoid, its face hidden in shadow, but its eyes were filled with something Alex had never seen before. Not fear, not desperation, but something far worse. Defiance. It reached out toward her, its hand trembling, but its stance unyielding. Alex stopped in her tracks. She had never felt this before. This resistance. The figure spoke, its voice rough but clear. Asterisk, you think you've won. Asterisk, it whispered. The words sent a shiver down Alex's spine. Asterisk, this place is not yours. Not yet. Asterisk. The whispering grew louder, a furious hum reverberating in the void. The space around them seemed to bend, warping as if the very fabric of the darkness was tearing. Alex felt something stir within her, something she hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. A flicker of doubt, but it was quickly swallowed by the darkness inside her, a force she could no longer ignore. I've always been here, Alex whispered, her voice quiet, but filled with certainty. But the figure didn't flinch. It reached out again, its eyes locking onto hers with an intensity she hadn't anticipated. Asterisk, then why do you still fight? Asterisk. The void around them trembled. The whispers escalated into a scream, and as the figure closed the distance, the darkness began to unravel. Not with the calm inevitability Alex had known, but with an eruption, a force unlike anything she had experienced before. And in that moment, she realized the truth. The darkness was not just a prison. It was a battleground. For the first time in what felt like forever, Alex felt fear. Real fear. The cycle might not be as unbreakable as she had thought. The darkness around Alex seemed to pulse, its very fabric bending and twisting, as though it could no longer hold itself together. The figure's defiance was like a spark in the black. Something new, something dangerous. Alex felt the power surge within her, but for the first time, it wasn't the all-consuming force she was used to. This wasn't the mindless, suffocating void that had claimed her before. This was something alive, something that fought back. The whispers grew louder, their tone frantic now, as if the darkness itself was aware of the shift. The figure before her didn't shrink away. It stepped forward, its hand reaching out, and for a moment, Alex thought she saw the faintest glimmer of light in its eyes, a truth long buried beneath layers of darkness. The void wasn't eternal. Asterisk, you're not alone. Asterisk. The words hit Alex like a physical blow. The world around her seemed to freeze. It was impossible. She was the darkness. Or so she had believed. But now, the truth clawed at her. There had been others who had come before, others who had not been consumed by the void. And now, they were here, standing before her. The figure's eyes were filled with something Alex had never seen before. Hope, a spark of rebellion against the endless abyss. Alex could feel the weight of it pressing on her. The darkness, once her domain, was beginning to unravel. She reached out, her hand trembling, fighting the urge to pull it back. The figure's touch was warm, real. For a brief second, the void seemed to fade, like a fading memory that couldn't hold its ground. Alex felt herself split in two, the darkness pulling at her, but the warmth of the figure anchoring her. You've always been here, she whispered, but this time, the words didn't ring true. For the first time, she understood. She had never truly been alone. And in that understanding, the void finally began to crumble, its hold on her broken. The light, however faint, began to seep through the cracks. The darkness began to fade, its grip weakening, like a shadow dissipating in the first light of dawn. Alex stood at the center of it, the figure still beside her, its hand still gently resting on hers. For the first time, she felt the weight of her own existence, the pull of her own humanity, and it was nothing like the emptiness she had once known. The whispers had quieted, their frantic energy now replaced by an eerie calm. The void no longer felt oppressive, but almost peaceful. Alex's breath came slowly, steadying as the last remnants of the darkness unraveled around her. She turned to the figure, its eyes still filled with that quiet hope. It wasn't fear she saw in its gaze now, but understanding, and in that understanding, Alex found her own clarity. The truth was simple, yet so much more complex than she had ever realized. The void had never been her home. Not really. It was a reflection, a manifestation of her own fears, her own doubts, the darkness she had carried within her. But now, she could see it for what it was, a space of endless potential. And the figure beside her wasn't just a part of the void. It was a part of her own journey, a symbol of everything she had to face, everything she had to overcome. "We don't have to stay here," the figure whispered, its voice a soft, comforting sound in the stillness. Alex nodded, the last of her uncertainty melting away. The darkness had been both her prison and her mirror, but now it was just the past, and the future was hers to shape. With a final, deep breath, she let go of the shadows, the cold, the fear, and as the first rays of light began to filter through the cracks, Alex stepped forward into the unknown. Her steps were light, her heart full of possibility. The void no longer called to her. It had no hold. She was free, and for the first time in a long time, she was not alone.